Good afternoon and welcome to this panel on brain death, the Uniform Determination of Death Act, and the latest arguments from the front lines. My name is Farr Curlin from Duke University, and I will be the moderator for the panel. We have three esteemed speakers who have a lot to say, a good content, so we're going to get right into it. Our first speaker is Chris DeCock, who is a clinical associate professor of pediatrics at University of North Dakota School of Medicine and Health Sciences and practices pediatric neurology and epilepsy at Essentia Health. Chris holds an MS in bioethics from the University of Mary and is currently serving as an observer for the Uniform Law Commission's drafting committee on the revision for the Uniform Determination of Death Act. After Chris, we'll hear from Jeffrey Bishop, who is professor of philosophy at St. Louis University, where he holds the Tenet Endowed Chair in Bioethics. Jeff is also director there of the CREST Research Center, which promotes interdisciplinary conversation on novel scientific discoveries and technological innovations and their impacts on society. He is the author of The Anticipatory Corpse, Medicine, Power, and the Care of the Dying, which many of us have found quite provocative and helpful for getting our head around this world of healthcare today, as well as Biopolitics After Neuroscience, Morality, and the Economy of Virtue. And after Jeff, we'll hear from Charlie Camosy, who is professor of medical humanities at the Creighton University School of Medicine and holds the Monsignor Curlin Fellowship in Moral Theology at St. Joseph Seminary in New York. Before that, Charlie spent 14 years in Fordham University's theology department, where he taught after he finished his PhD in moral theology from Notre Dame. Charlie's the author of 8 books, most recently, Losing Our Dignity: How Secularized Medicine is Undermining Fundamental Human Equality. And so the speakers are going to speak in that order, first to kind of set the context, and then in reverse order to make some arguments and some proposals for what they think is a reasonable way of making sense of that context and moving forward. And then we'll have time for you to ask questions of them. So Chris, why don't you get us started?
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. All right. So today we're going to talk about brain death, the UDDA, and the latest arguments from the front lines. So unfortunately, I have to give a disclosure that my views may or may not reflect those of my employer. And so if you've been in medical ethics, you know exactly what that means. So, but before we begin, I would like to start with a prayer to St. Michael. We are in spiritual warfare. This is a spiritual battle. I don't think we can ignore that fact. So let's begin. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. Thank you. All right, so it is a medical fact that women who are diagnosed as brain dead by the current clinical criteria, and by the way, by the new proposed criteria that came out 3 weeks ago, can go through puberty and gestate pregnancies. Now, that should seem a little concerning to you, that we're talking about people who are doing things that don't seem consistent with death. Now, I wanted to start with that, but we have to take some steps back and talk about what is the Uniform Determination of Death Act. So, simply put, the Uniform Determination of Death Act was promulgated by the Uniform Law Commission in 1981. In general, it is the law of the land regarding death. Most states have adopted it in one form or another. And what it says is, in order to be determined dead, you have to have irreversible loss of cardiac function, irreversible loss of lung function, and that is death, or You can have irreversible loss of all functions in the entire brain, including the brain stem. That is also death. Now, to be clear, it is not two different deaths, it's one death based on the concept of loss of integration. That's what the 1981 President's Council stated that they were going for. Now, here's the actual wording. You can see an individual who sustained either irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions or irreversible cessations of all functions in the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. The determination of death must be made in accordance with medical standards. That's it. That's the whole law. So what is the Uniform Law Commission? As Farr said, I am an observer on the Uniform Law Commission's revision for the Uniform Determination of Death Act, and yes, that is a big mouthful, I understand that. I'm going to refer to the Uniform Law Commission as the ULC from here on in. So it's a group of lawyers, which first of all should give us pause, that decide where in the law uniformity would be good. So for example, the reason they dealt with the determination of death was they were like, well, it should make sense that someone who is dead in North Dakota, where I come from, is also dead in North Carolina, where Farr comes from. And so that's how the Uniform Law Commission had something to do with it. So the revision of the Uniform Determination of Death Act was felt that it should go back to the Uniform Law Commission. Now, to be clear, they do not make laws. They propose laws to states who can then enact those laws. So that's why, in general, the Uniform Determination of Death Act, or the UDDA, is generally the law of the land, but there are some variations. Now, how do you determine that someone is brain dead? So I'm going to step away from irreversible loss of cardiopulmonary function, and we're going to focus in on brain death determination, or death by neurologic criteria. So the current American Academy of Neurology practice guidelines are this. If you have a coma, you have loss of cranial nerves, and you have loss of respiratory drive, you're dead. The problem is the part of the brain that allows you to gestate pregnancies and go through puberty is not actually tested. And in fact, in the latest guidelines, they said it's just not important. Now, I would argue that that part of the brain, the hypothalamus, where neuroendocrine function exists, is very important. According to the Cleveland Clinic, your hypothalamus is your body's smart control coordinating center, and it helps to manage body temperature, blood pressure, hunger and thirst, sense of fullness when eating, mood, sex drive, and sleep. So at least for half of the group here, sex drive is important. So, and I'll let you decide which half of the group that is. So, right now, the current proposal to change the Uniform Determination of Death Act is one that's called the neurorespiratory proposal, or some people call it the brain as a whole proposal, not to be confused with whole brain death. What they propose is that an individual who sustained either permanent cessation of circulatory or respiratory functions or permanent coma, permanent cessations of spontaneous respiratory functions, and permanent loss of brainstem reflexes is dead. So a couple of take-home points here. First of all, the word irreversible is changed to permanent. Irreversible means in the medical literature that you cannot reverse. Permanent means you will not reverse. So there's an arbitrariness that goes with that word permanent. Now, this proposal was backed by these folks here. So first of all, the reporter for our drafting committee, Dr. Nita Farahani, over here, wrote that life and death should begin with consciousness. And in fact, her first proposal was that life and death should begin with consciousness. Luckily, we were able to backpedal on that one because, oddly enough, you can only test for awareness. You can't actually test for all consciousness, so we were able to get her to back off on that. Other individuals involved here, like Adrian Lewis and Matthew Kirshen, they have written the latest AAN guidelines, as well as the Brain Death Project. Over here, Kaplan is a big proponent of what's called normothermic regional perfusion. So that's after cardiopulmonary death. What they do is they restart the heart or reperfuse the body, clamp off the arteries to the brain in order to kill it so that they have nice, fresh, happy organs. Oddly enough, he's in favor of this. And then lastly, Dr. Magnus here is the is the editor of the American Journal of Bioethics. He also is very much in favor of this neurorespiratory proposal, which, to be clear, is not whole brain death. It is partial brain death. And this is supported by the American Academy of Neurology. And the reason why is their proposal is just this. It is the current AAN practice guidelines. They want the practice guidelines to be the basis of law. So they state that coma, loss of cranial nerves, loss of respiratory drives is enough, and that hypothalamic function is unimportant. So why would you change the determination of death? Well, basically, if you can't think, a lot of people think that you shouldn't be alive, right? If you can't exercise your autonomy, your life has no purpose, right? The other thing is right now the practice of medicine is breaking the law. The Uniform Determination of Death Act says that the whole brain has to be dead. They're not testing for whole brain death. They're testing for partial brain death. Obviously, organ perfusion is involved, organ donation is involved, as well as normothermic regional perfusion. There are donor care units coming up. There's this procedure called whole body gestational donation where they use chronic brain dead patients as incubators for other people's pregnancies. That is pushing this as well. There's obviously the utilitarian bent. We want to get rid of these who are unworthy to be alive. And sad though it may be, money is involved. These are the proposals before the Uniform Law Commission to change the determination of death to align with the current clinical criteria or to keep the determination of death. And so if you change it, dead enough becomes dead. It is a non-biological death. You decrease certitude, you violate intrinsic human dignity, and you kill patients to harvest their organs. Or the other proposal was just to leave it alone. The people in favor of this, the American Academy of Neurology, transplantation societies, donor services, transplant networks, health organizations, hospital associations. And Arizona actually was honest and said, no, there's no medical consensus. We shouldn't be doing this. And on the flip side of the coin, here are all the organizations opposed to it. It took a lot of effort to get these all on one slide. I'm just saying. And I'm not going to read them all to you. So the timeline is we've got one fight now or 50 fight laters. The drafting committee first met in fall of 2000. The neurorespiratory proposal was imposed on the committee in the spring of 2023, and the first meeting was in the summer of 2023. Luckily, in September, the ULC decided to put this effort on hold.
Thank you, Chris. Jeff?
All right, I'm going to do a bit of a historical and conceptual overview, mostly focusing on the conceptual overview of the idea of death and the idea of brain death. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about social need, and then I'm going to talk about the reality we're trying to get at. Then I'm going to talk about the conceptual definition that we have and operational definitions. So we have to think about it in the terms of these things, okay? There's always a social motivation for need to determine death. In the medieval Europe, it might have been who's the lord of the realm and is he dead? If he's dead, then somebody, the heir, takes over the duties and responsibilities of being the king or the duke or whatever, right? So there are pushes in society that make us want to ask the question, is he dead yet? Okay? For the modern America, it is, can he be a donor? Is he an eligible donor? So there's a social need to push for the question. Okay? Now, this is a busy slide, but I think it's an important slide because when we ask, is he dead, we start to have what matters about being alive. Okay, so dead is actually a privation. It's a non-existence, right? And you're looking for a negative when you're asking, is he dead? Because what you really mean is he alive? And so what matters becomes the metaphysical or the reality or the state of affairs that you're trying to get at, okay? And it's usually prompted by a question. Then we have to say, well, what is the conceptual definition? So we want the reality we care about to inform how we're going to put this into concepts and into ideas, into theories, okay? So we go from the reality to the concept, and we want the concept to be shaped by the reality, okay? But then we've got a reality that's a non-reality, right? Dead. It's not living. Okay, so now we've got a double whammy there. It makes it really difficult to talk about a conceptual definition. And anytime you have a conceptual definition, you then have to have an operational definition. An operational definition is when you can pick out an instance of the concept of the reality that you're trying to get at. And the operational definition will have criteria and tests that go to construct the operational definition. All right, so is he dead yet prompts all kinds of questions. Well, what is death? Which prompts the question, what is life, right? So metaphysical questions always go deeper and deeper and deeper when we're trying to get to the fundamental nature of reality. And it's really difficult to get to the fundamental nature of reality. In medieval Europe, what is death? The answer might have been, well, when the soul leaves the body, which prompts the question, what is the living body and what is the soul, right? In contemporary culture, we might ask, what is death? The answer might be the loss of integrative functioning of the organism as a whole, okay? So we can go deeper and deeper with all of our sort of metaphysical questions. The conceptual definition is something a little different. It's our words. We're taking reality and trying to turn it into something that fits inside our heads. We can't get the reality in our heads, but we have words that help to mediate that reality into our thinking, okay? So we have to have conceptual definitions. And in the medieval world, death transpires when the soul leaves the body, when the animating principle, the answer to the question, is he dead? It's when the soul leaves the body, when the animating principle ceases to animate the material of the body, and it usually cashes out along a metaphysical idea called hylomorphism, at least for the medieval period, mostly in the medieval period. In our time, where the definition is the loss of integrative function of the human organism as a whole, specifically when there is cardiovascular collapse or when the whole brain ceases to integrate the functioning of the human organism, right? And those are the two definitions that you see that Chris pointed to, all right? The operational definition is that, as I said, every concept needs to have an operational definition so you know when the instance of the thing obtains in the world. So in the medieval period, we know the soul has left the body when there is no breath, or when no fog hits the mirror in front of the face. That would be the test. Or when there's rigor mortis. In our time, our answer to the question is when there is no longer any breath or heartbeat, cardiovascular criteria, or when the tests for the whole brain death obtain. Okay? So the operations of an operational definition are what the medical doctors decide they need to be. All right. But here's the thing. The all-important question is this. Do the criteria, when met, tell us when a person has died, or do they tell us that a person has died? Okay? I think it's only the latter, and that's where it becomes really, really important. So you remember that slide that I put up there, that image before? There it is. I had rigor mortis up there. I can be pretty sure when rigor mortis has happened that the person is dead, right? And we can be traditionally pretty certain that the person is dead when there's the absence of breaths and heart tones, okay? And then there's whole brain death. But the question is there's this line, this moment of death line that divides. And I'm not sure if life is a process and then death dying is living, but it's a process, it's a living process, right? But dead is slightly different. But then there's a process on the flip side of that, disintegration and decay, okay? So finding that line of distinction is really going to be hard, and I'm not sure that we have the concepts available to us or the tests that allow us to find that line. I think Chris differs a little bit on this. All right, so back to the social need. New social reality, 1950s, novel technology, the ventilator becomes available, and suddenly we have a lot of people who would have died on a machine, okay? Some of those people had something they called at that time coma de passe, a coma de passe, okay? No one ever questioned whether those people were dead, but they probably met brain death criteria. But they didn't have those back in 1967, let's say, okay? Then we get another thing that happens, the first heart transplant. We didn't have a definition of death that would have actually permitted a heart transplant, right? You have to take the beating heart out of someone and put it in someone else. And there, you know, how that happened is an interesting story, and I could tell you if you want to hear it. Then we get the Harvard Ad Hoc Law Committee. Why? Suddenly we've got this new technology where having some people who can be donors becomes really important. We did all kinds of kidney transplants. You only need one kidney before this. But when you started heart transplant, well, you gotta have a dead body, right? All right, and you can't kill them, which is what they did for the first one, but okay. So the ad hoc committee says we got to have a conceptual definition. So they started articulating a conceptual definition at that time. The president's commission kind of ratified that, kind of doubled down on that conceptual definition, and then it gets codified into law. It gets teeth. This conceptual definition gets some teeth, okay? So the doctors articulate the criteria for the operational definition, and they administer the tests, okay? Now, it's really funny that this commission decided that they didn't really want to engage in arcane philosophy. And what they meant was we don't want to deal with anything metaphysical. We didn't want to do with anything like souls or life forces, okay? They just said, we're not doing metaphysics, okay? And then they went on to do metaphysics, okay? The commission argued for a conceptual definition of death that was rather traditional, that kind of fit into this so-called arcane philosophical position that had traditionally animated Western culture and particularly Christian culture, okay? Rather, the commission, like our culture, simply ended up enacting a metaphysical position and a conceptual definition without really admitting that they were having to make some pretty value-laden definitions of what death is, okay? And that's part of the problem I think that we have, is that we think we can deal with this as surface phenomena without talking about the things that matter, okay? The metaphysical moral dimension. Okay, whole process is a mess then. We have social need that pushes us to ask the question, and it keeps forcing us to ask the question, is he dead or not, right? As a culture, our problem is that we refuse to think metaphysically or deeply about these things because values might enter into the public sphere. And if we deny that we are engaged in metaphysical reasoning, what we end up doing is enacting a bad conceptual or confused conceptual definition. And right now, what's being pushed is that they're allowing the operational definition to push a new conceptual definition that no longer represents the metaphysical reality that we actually care about.
Thank you, Jeff. Charlie.
So my apologies, I do not have slides, so I'm just going to speak from the podium here. My remarks will start with context. We've heard two different remarks about context, but I'm going to switch midstream and make some arguments as well, and then my fellow panelists will offer their arguments. Peter Singer described the move towards or beyond a cardiopulmonary understanding of death to one that encompassed brain death as the beginning of a Copernican revolution. A Copernican revolution in ethics, which ultimately would replace an ethic grounded in the sanctity of human life. And his criticism of the Harvard Brain Death Commission that Jeff just mentioned and others who didn't get that this is what they had just done was scathing. But despite his very public scathing voice and those of a few others, the fact is that this Copernican revolution has largely gone unnoticed, unrealized. Singer even asks in his book, Rethinking Life and Death, The Collapse of Our Traditional Ethics, I think with genuine curiosity, where was the pro-life movement? Where was the Catholic Church? Well, Catholics seem to have accepted this change largely because St. John Paul II and others wrote some things which seemed to indicate that. But there was pushback as well. In looking around for a Roman Catholic intellectual authority on the matter, one could hardly find better credentials than those belonging to John Finnis. Finnis, in a response given to Peter Singer's paper, Brain Death and the Sanctity of Life Ethic, said the following, quote, Singer's second aim is to show that there are serious problems with accepting brain death as a criterion of death. I think he succeeds in this aim, end quote. With regard to magisterial issues, Christian Brugger says, quote, the church's and hence the Pope's authority to teach only extends to matters of faith and morals. It is clear that the reliability of the scientific premise rests entirely on the soundness of the scientific data and the interpretation of that data. Thus, the papal affirmation that the neurological standard is a reliable indicator of death is not grounded in any truth of faith or morals. Brugger himself apparently has, quote, reasonable doubt about brain death being actual death. And one important reason why a significant and growing number of faithful Catholic theologians and philosophers have been skeptical is the case of TK, a patient of Dr. Alan Schumann, who is a very important voice in these matters, who, though supposedly brain dead, survived more than 20 years after being so declared. Another eminent and faithful Catholic bioethicist, theologian, and scientist, Nick Ostriaco, took to the pages of the Journal of the Catholic Medical Association, to give his evaluation of TK's autopsy. He found that indeed the whole brain had died, and yet TK remained a living human organism with blood pressure homeostasis, a robust immune response, and proportionate growth. The case of TK, argued Ostriaco, is, quote, proof of principle that the human organism does not need a brain to maintain its integration, end quote. To these examples, I would add the debate at the Catholic Medical Association annual meeting 2 years ago, which was a formal debate on brain death. If you know anything about the Catholic Medical Association, you know they're a very, very faithful group of Catholic physicians who would it would be very unusual if they would have a debate about something that was completely settled regarding medical ethics. And I'd also add that there is no current ERD, I just checked, there's no current ethical and religious directive surrounding brain death for Catholic institutions. So I'll say more about that later. I think there should be one, but maybe it's one that needs to hold its fire a little bit. But the fact that there's nothing about it is also worth mentioning as well. Now, Schumann says, moving to clinicians here, Schumann says that most clinicians aren't even aware that there is a raging discourse, a raging debate about brain death. The clinicians to my left are the exceptions to this, of course. But more broadly, they just simply accept what they were taught in medical school and residency, Schumann says. It says that brain death is death, and it's diagnosed according to published guidelines of the American Academy of Neurology for adults and the Joint Society guidelines for children. You just check off the boxes and move on to the next patient without further thinking about it. But if you ask those same clinicians why brain death is death, you don't even get a coherent response, and there is no consensus. This is a very important point. Indeed, Case Western Reserve University did a study of physicians and nurses who worked with brain dead patients to conclude that over half used the concept of death in an inconsistent way. When asked to justify their claim that someone was dead, 1/3 said either the patient was, quote, irreversibly dying, or made reference to a patient's, quote, unacceptable quality of life. Another study at Michigan State University asked 13 nurses and 7 physicians, all of whom were neurologists or neurosurgeons with extensive experience with brain dead patients, to describe what they would tell the family of a brain dead patient. Here are some of the responses. Quote, at this point in time, it doesn't look like the patient is going to survive. Quote, the machine is the way he would have to live the rest of his life. Quote, the machine is basically what is keeping him alive. Quote, if on the respirator, the patient would die. If kept on the respirator, the patient would die of sepsis. I'll spare you the rest, but that gives you a sense of how it's kind of all over the place. And yet the confidence with which the medical profession uses the brain death standard in light of this is absolutely staggering. You've probably heard of the case that Chris mentioned earlier about Jahai McMath, or at least it was on his slide. A terrible story of a young African-American girl who was thought to be brain dead, and so confidently thought to be brain dead that according to her lawyer and the family, saw the head of PEDS about their disagreement about the fact that she was brain dead, and according to them, he pounded his fists on the table and said, "She's dead, dead, dead. What is it you don't understand?" Can you imagine? Incidentally, if you know the story, you know they moved her from California to New Jersey, where I live, which happens to be the only explicit state in the union that says you can come and take care of people who are diagnosed with brain death based on your religious freedom. I'm embarrassed to say it wasn't Catholics in New Jersey that fought for this, it was Orthodox Jews. Maybe you've also heard in that story that after Dr. Durand pounded his fist on the table in front of the family, Jahai McMath got her first period. And later, even years later, the Journal of Neurosurgical Sciences would make up a new and retroactive diagnosis for her called responsive unawake syndrome. Responsive unawake syndrome. The confusion is not limited to the clinical crowd. It's broader confusion in the culture, especially in the media. My favorite AP headline of all time about this is "Pregnant brain dead woman gives birth, then dies." So that my context is, I started to give a Catholic context, and then the more broader context is just tremendous confusion, the opposite of anything like consensus. That's where we are. My views. I must admit to being skeptical about brain death as death. I'm likely formed from my engagement with Singer, as I agree that this was a real revolution in how to think about ethics. Really the first time we unambiguously got super comfortable with describing living, breathing, pulsating members of the species Homo sapiens as non-persons. Conference theme, call out. As I mentioned at last year's panel, when we were talking about neural organoids and chimeras, I think that especially with the Thomistic Aristotelian understanding of the soul's relationship with the body, it makes it easier to understand how some philosophers of mine have come to think about consciousness today as a kind of mysterious product. Philosophers of mine talking about it as a currently mysterious product of the whole organism, broadly conceived, not locating it in the brain. There's almost no one now that thinks we can sort of locate consciousness literally inside the brain. Even philosophers like Daniel Dennett have said because we can't locate it in the brain, we must not be conscious. Schumann, who spent lots of time with McMath and the family, I think agrees with their claim that she not only got her first period, but apparently responded to commands. There's interesting YouTube footage online about that, which I guess could have been faked, but he was somebody that I respect and spent a lot of time with them. Stuff that would not be able to be explained merely by, say, the continuing function of a hypothalamus, right? Which is probably also true, but that's something different. Also looming large for me in making my skepticism present is the fact that there are prenatal human beings, persons, without brains, who are clearly members of the human family. The placenta, I think it's interesting to point out, is a shared organ between mother and child, and from my read of the clinical literature, and I'd defer to others on the panel or in the audience who know more about this than I do to say more about this, but from my read of the literature, the placenta really plays a significant role in the development of the child, and perhaps even helps direct the integrated growth of the child in ways that would make it odd to think of the child, that kind of child, as fully self-integrating. Depending what we mean by that, the integration of the child at that stage is in relationship with her mother. And so arguments about the need for self-integration, at least to the extent I understand them, unnecessarily preclude integration that can be aided by another person or community using technology. And we should be unsurprised to have this be the case. If we're Christians, a Trinitarian anthropology is, of course, living in that place of tension between the individual and the relational, right? And that's definitely a place I think we could talk about that being understood in a particularly Christian key. So to me, it's hardly surprising that some Human beings require the aid of intensely intimate relationships with other human beings in order to integrate themselves. And so when it comes to brain death, I currently count myself with thinkers like Austriaco and Pruger and Finnis. But here's an important place of agreement, and I think we're going to, despite making arguments that slightly disagree with each other, we're going to finish, I think, with a sense of agreement here, especially with regard to policy. If we are going to keep the whole brain death criteria, and that's what we're doing in a particularly Catholic context, we must take the idea of testing for whole brain death seriously and test far more robustly to make sure it is, in fact, the whole brain that has died, including for hypothalamic function. We must fiercely resist attempts to merely ensconce the testing that is currently being done, which my two previous panelists so ably pointed out. Thank you.
All right, so we have essentially new social pressures that are kind of pushing us to kind of ask again, is this thing dead, right? Increased pressures to get more organs is one of those. Novel approaches to stay within the law while getting more organs, and it at best seems macabre, if not frankly immoral, on some of these, especially the normothermic regional perfusion. I find it a little creepy. They're trying to stay within the law, but it seems a little weird. And these practices seem problematic at best to me. Pressure 3, uneven use and deployment of the current operational operational criteria for diagnosing death. Pressure number 4, people start to ask, well, what is it that we really care about? And some people have wanted, as Nina was trying to do, is to say it's about consciousness. But that requires a different kind of conceptual definition, and that's a different, but what you're really interested in is not consciousness, but the absence of it, right? All right, so they need to change the metaphysical question from is he a living being to is he a conscious being, or has consciousness been lost forever? The traditional human, we've always said, traditionally is more than the sum of our consciousness, right? Pressure number 4, we are letting those who use the operational definition and probably misuse it. I've had to correct people many times on when they say, oh, the person is brain dead, and I'll say, no, actually they're not, because it's just, we start to use language, there's slippage in the practice of the use of precise language. But what's happening is we've got the tests we do, and we're letting that drive then the conceptual definition rather than the other way around. All right. The operational definition driving the conceptual definition enacts a different kind of metaphysical reality that and it's not the one we care about, right? So we we're going at it backwards here. Got the cart before the horse. Pressure number 7 is just a cultural increasing, emphasis on utilitarian thinking. Kind of the metaphysics of efficient causation kind of rule everything. Pressure number 8, I should decide when my life has value, and therefore there's this push in that direction. There's a pressure to push in that direction. And with an increasing sense that we can technologically have control over the world, we seem to have lost the capacity to see creation as life, and as see creation and life as a gift, okay? So because of these social pressures, there is a drive to ask different kinds of metaphysical questions, change to consciousness. What is consciousness then? Really, we're having to say, well, no, what we're really concerned about is the lack of consciousness, or the lack of capacity for consciousness, or the permanent lack of consciousness. There's the sense that, well, is there a moment of death? Well, it's really hard to say whether there's a moment of death. Or is there a moment of lost consciousness when you're one moment conscious and the next not? Well, no, I don't know that we'll ever find a line like that. And then this idea of an irreversible lack of consciousness, that's probably going to be unique to the particular organism that we have. Some people's brains will be operating differently. A pediatric brain is going to be different and has more neuroplasticity to it than an adult brain. So what do we mean here? Irreversible lack of consciousness. And so suddenly we've got this gap in there that we don't know quite how to step into. So we got to have conceptual definition. We got to have operational definitions for consciousness. Other people will look, I just want to be able to donate. If I have a terminal condition, let's say ALS, and I want to donate my organs, but I have to wait till my organs are dying or dead, My heart stops. Well, I don't want to do that. So this is the kind of willfulness thing. Well, what is an autonomous agent then? That becomes the brakes on this, right? What's an autonomous agent that wills to be dead? And that person can donate, right? A non-autonomous agent can't donate. But then we got to have a moment of consent, right? And then we got to have a operational and conceptual definitions of moments of consent. How would we know when somebody who wills their death, how do we know they're not depressed, for instance? Can we unpick all these things from each other? And I don't think we can. As I said before, the American Academy of Neurology's definition really is the operations are driving the concepts, and they're not necessarily naming what we have, as a culture said, is death, okay? So we're back to this. Yeah, okay. So we're back to, I'm going to finish early, actually. We're back to this slide. Where are we going to draw this line? Is there a moment of death? I don't know that I'm not sure I think there is one, first of all. I'm just not sure. But if there is one, I don't know that we'll have the conceptual apparatus or the operational tools to name the moment, okay? So we can only really say what is. And it seems to me that this definition of an integrative functioning of the organism as a whole is a pretty good place to draw a line, unless we slip further and further to that side, right? To this side, to this idea that we're starting to intervene on, cause harm to those beings that we have always traditionally said have some sort of value.
Thank you, Jeff.
All right. Well, you have to listen to me again, so I apologize. All right. So let's wrap this up. So I actually differ from Charlie. I actually think that whole brain death can be death. I also differ from Jeff that I believe that there can be a moment of death. And so let me lay this out, and I'll show you how it works. So right off the bat, we can be pretty sure that death occurs when there's the departure of the soul from the body. That is a moment. That's why I think death has to be a moment. There is a moment when the soul leaves the body. There is a moment in the body where entropy, where chaos overwhelms homeostasis. There is a point of no return where, come hell or high water, we can't do anything about it. Now, we also know that the form of man is the rational soul. However, death is not natural to him by virtue of the soul. But the matter of man, our bodies, can be corrupted. And that's what allows us to die. Now, do we die because the soul leaves the body, or does the soul leave the body when we're dead? And I actually think it's the latter. And the abbot of Belfast Abbey, Ansgar Vonnier, put this quite well, I feel. He states that a spirit like the soul can only be the form of the body if certain material dispositions and predispositions are provided for its reception. These all-important predispositions are produced by efficient causes, the generating parent, and many other factors. Now, other efficient causes may undermine those indispensable dispositions, nay, even destroy them completely. This is the action we call death. Therefore, death is not a separation between soul and body. It's a breaking up, the dissolution of the body. The soul is said to depart because death has occurred, because the organism has died, and not vice versa. Man is not dead because his soul has left the body, but because he is dead, the soul departs. So, I've already said, there is a moment of death. I completely agree with Leon Cass that there's a moment of death, because there's a moment when the soul leaves the body. Now, when we think about what we are, according to Bernard Lonergan, we are a unity identity whole. And when we cease to be the kind of thing that we are is when we cease to be a human. So when we cease to lose that unity identity whole is when we die, when we dissolve, when we disintegrate. Now, Dr. Daniel Somasi and I proposed that an organism that is judged to have been irrevocably lost the fundamental capacity to be a substantially self-integrating individual member of the biological kind can be declared dead. When he ceases to be a unity identity whole, he no longer is the kind of thing that he is, and therefore he is said to be dead. Now, how can we figure this out? Well, let's look at cardiopulmonary death. Cardiopulmonary death, we know when someone's heart and lungs stop, and when they're not talking to us, because let's be fair, if they're talking to us and their heart and lungs have stopped, we've got a problem. But if they're no longer interacting with us, we know that they're dead. We know they will disintegrate and die, right? We also know that when all functions in the entire brain, including the brainstem, are lost, those individuals will disintegrate and die. So TK, as much as they want to say he didn't have a brain, he had persistent hypothalamic function. He was not in a state of diabetes insipidus. He did not have saltwater wasting. And so on autopsy, when they did not see brain structures, and by the way, he developed diabetes insipidus before he died from cardiopulmonary death, I would argue that TK actually did have hypothalamic function. In addition, there has never been a case in the literature where a patient with loss of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem, have not disintegrated and died. We know that. That is a medical fact. Thank you. Now, the other thing that Charlie pointed out is we can't be organ specific, right? Obviously, you can't talk about brain death in someone who doesn't have a brain. And so Dr. Somasi and I looked at what are these things that allow us to exist. Well, first of all, there's mind-body integration, right? So you have to have some unity of the body and the soul, right? There's also respiratory integration, right? Respiration is the key for aerobic metabolism. That's how we can exchange oxygen for CO2. That's a basis of all metabolism. You have to have circulatory integration, right? Because if you exchange CO2 and O2 in the lungs, but you can't get it anywhere else, well, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good, right? And those three, loss of mind-body integration, loss of respiratory integration, loss of circulatory integration, is cardiopulmonary death. What is brain death? It's loss of mind-body integration, loss of respiratory integration, and loss of cerebral somatic homeostatic integration. It is the loss of that function that the American Academy of Neurology states is unimportant. Now, the USCCB came out with a recent statement about the efforts for the Uniform Law Commission. They stated the commission should retain the standard of whole brain death by maintaining the current UDD language. Moreover, it should encourage medical professionals to update clinical testing guidelines to fully comply with the current legal definition of brain death, not to change the legal definition to comply with the deficient medical criteria. The clinical criteria are good. They're good at determining partial brain death. They're terrible at determining whole brain death. And to be clear, Jahi McNath was not whole brain dead. Now, if we look at it, there's the neurorespiratory proposal. Dr. Somasi and I proposed that we should keep the determination of death and expand the clinical criteria. This was supported by the American College of Physicians, an organization 4 times larger than the AAN. We were dismissed because it would cut the available number of organs in half. It was not even considered. And yet, it would promote prudential certitude, and it would protect intrinsic human dignity. So just to track the neurorespiratory criteria, you can see is A plus B. It's basically brainstem death. That's the UK standard. That's brainstem death. That's what The American Academy of Neurology wants to be the standard, and it's in the World Brain Death Project as well. They want this to be the standard for death. We argue that no, you need to have loss of cerebrosomatic homeostatic integration. So where does that bring us? Well, about 3 weeks ago, the American Academy of Neurology came out with new practice guidelines, since they were unable to change the determination of death legally. They stated, death by neurologic criteria, commonly referred to as brain death, occurs in individuals who have sustained catastrophic brain injury with no evidence of function of the brain as a whole, which is partial brain death, by the way. It's gerrymandering the language. It's basically saying, on the whole, the brain is dead. Well, it's not actually whole brain death. And they also state that the state of death has to be permanent, no longer irreversible. They also state that they are the accepted medical standard, which should be followed. And again, they say it's permanent loss of function, and you will see these three again: coma, brainstem areflexia, and apnea. They want the current clinical criteria to become the litmus of truth. And here are the wonderful people that wrote that statement. You can see some of the same people: Dr. Greer, Dr. Curlin, Dr. Lewis. Unfortunately, my adult neurology preceptor, Dr. Gronseth, signed up on this as well. I was very disappointed by that. So we know there's a problem, but what can we do about it? Well, as a physician, the first thing I tell people is, look, you need to let people know. You need to let your friends, you need to let your family know, you need your patients know. No one heard anything about this because guess what? They wanted to push it through without having to defend or justify their actions. Families are unaware that the criteria for determining death are inadequate. And there is a big push, as Jeff pointed out, for normothermic regional perfusion, for whole body gestational donation, for money, etc. The other thing is we need to talk with our hospitals. Expanded testing is not difficult. It promotes certitude and it protects intrinsic human dignity. And then lastly, I hate to say it, you may need to consider changing your organ donor status. Organ donation is a great gift, and I am still an organ donor. But you have to be dead. As Benedict XVI said, organ donation is only permissible ex cadavere. If you are not dead, if your whole brain has not died, if you have not passed that point where entropy overwhelms homeostasis, where you disintegrate, you are not dead. And if we take your organs, we are killing you. So our take-home points, and this is all of us, we put this together and we'll have this up for questions. First of all humans, regardless of disease or disability, have intrinsic human dignity and must be respected and protected. And we must have a preferential option for those with profound disease or disability. We have to protect the vulnerable. We have an obligation to do that. And our understanding of death must be made on stable and real criteria, not on what will produce the highest number of vital organs for transplantation. To put it in catechism language, the order of things must be subordinate to the order of persons, not the other way around. So that's Gaudium et Spes. Also, we are embodied persons, not persons accidentally inhabiting bodies. Therefore, understanding biology is an essential part of what it means to understand death. A partial brain death standard states that the body doesn't matter, and if the body happens to be alive, who cares? Since I can't exercise my autonomy, it doesn't matter. That is not acceptable. I would argue that loss of self-integration is based on biology. I think it is a good standard marker for the determination of death because all patients who have lost self-integration have disintegrated and died. The neurorespiratory or brain as a whole proposal is not a biological proposal. Dead enough by ignoring cerebrosomatic homeostatic integration is unacceptable. It ignores prudential certitude and it violates intrinsic human dignity. I would argue, and Charlie may disagree with me a little bit, but I think that expanding testing, ensuring that we're actually testing the whole brain, can promote certitude and honors the intrinsic human dignity of our patients. Now, the ULC effort is paused, but we can't be complacent. If so, we're in danger of winning the battle, but losing the war. I guarantee you they are constantly acting. I'm constantly having to respond to this. The AAN, as Jeff pointed out, is letting the operational definition of death change the conceptual definition, one that is unacceptable to most people. I guarantee you, if you went around and told people, hey, we're going to change death so that you're not actually biologically dead, but we've decided you're dead enough and now we're going to harvest your organs, I'm guessing the vast majority of people wouldn't be on board with that. Now, what I would say about the AAN practice guidelines is when you have a test that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, you should improve testing. You shouldn't change the definition of the disease to what the testing is. And then lastly, we need to make people aware of this issue. So thank you so much for your time. Oh, here's our contact information if you want to write it down, but I'm going to pull up those take-home slides again, and if you want us to put it back on, we're happy to do that.
Okay, our speakers have left us. I see good. I was going to ask you, if you want to ask a question, to line up behind one of the microphones. Remember, a good question is brief, civil, and a question. And because we have folks lining up, guys, I'm going to go straight to the questions, and you can get out any other lingering things you want to say through those. We'll start here, and we'll go back and forth. Go ahead.
I'll certainly try to be civil. I don't know if I can be brief.
You got to be brief.
I think this has been, I'm a pediatric neurologist who works in New York with children. And I'm also an Orthodox Christian, and I take this all very seriously. But I think the way that brain death is being talked about is really misleading. This is not, like conflating it as it in some places with conscious. I think some of the concerns are, that I understand, is the worry that the children who have severe injuries, we're going to say that they're not worth the same thing. That's a very valid concern. I think another concern seems to be about misdiagnosis of brain death, also a valid concern. But if it's done properly, what is our first act? Our first act is to breathe, which is why the soul in a lot of traditions is located in breath. We are functionally dependent on the world around us. The only reason that we have to do this whole procedure is because someone is on a vent because they cannot breathe. If we simply remove the vent, they're dead, and no one is going to have a discussion about this. Full stop, unless it's a misdiagnosis. Number two,
we gotta, just in interest, there's so many folks who.
I know, but I just don't want people to leave here thinking this is so controversial. The whole thing is, I live in a state where there's also a lot of Orthodox Jews. I see these kids when they're admitted. But brain death is irreversible. They don't come back a year later better. So I actually think, I'm sorry they don't have a question, but I actually think that this is a wonderful conference. But I think this is sort of a inaccurate description, and believe it or not, I'm defending the AAN. I have done this many, many times, and nobody comes back. This is about prognosis, and so it's about seeing the future. Which is the only time we can do it.
Thank you.
So I will say that, yes, people do not recover from catastrophic brain injury. That doesn't mean they're dead. They are severely disabled, but they are still alive. If they are dead, they would disintegrate and die. We are rational animals. All other creation, when it loses integration, disintegrates and dies. We are not different. We are biological organisms, and if the body continues, if entropy does not overwhelm homeostasis, if you are going through puberty and gestating pregnancies, you're not dead.
Okay, next question.
Thank you all very much. So some people might make the claim that Jahi McMath was just coordinating her functions for 4 years rather than integrating. That's a confusing statement to me, and I'd love to have you guys respond to that and just say, can we detect someone integrating versus coordination, and does that matter? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it's me again. I think we have to be clear about our language. Language is so important. Like I said, the difference between irreversible and permanent is so close. To me, this coordinating as opposed to integrating is an attempt to sidestep, to say that what she was doing was lesser importance. Now, to be clear, as Charlie said, he felt that some functions she was doing, couldn't be in the hypothalamus. Well, the hypothalamus is associated with rudimentary consciousness. We don't test for the thalamus. We can't. That's associated with sensory modulation. That's right next to the hypothalamus. What the problem is that, again, death is a reality. And if you continue, you are not dead. And I think that people have been trying to say that I think this goes back to the old idea of the brain as a master integrator of the body. No, it is not. Again, you cannot be organ specific. And so I think it's just a clever way to try and say that what she was doing wasn't actually integrating function.
Great. Next question.
Bo Bonner, integrated biological organism. On that note,
Self-integrated.
well, okay,
Arguably,
thank you for
arguably.
Thank you, alley-ooped me there. I think the metaphysical fight has to be about integration, which has been long assumed. I'm going off Jeff. Like I agree with you, Jeff, that death is always going to be, even if there's a moment of death, our linguistic conceptual naming of it is always past it. Like we go, death has now occurred. But I actually think integration is sort of a similar way. We name integration, so to speak, after the fact of observing evidence of it. And so if we talk about self-integrating organisms, I start to see the sort of utilitarian aggregation theory of it undergirding it, which is why, Charlie, you were talking about the placenta as like a constitutive of integration of a natal organ. You could get in like dumb arguments like, well, if not for the strong and weak nuclear force, who among us would have molecular integration? And so like, does that mean I'm a self-integrating being? So I think that's the future of the fight in the dorky trenches, is to get very specific about what we mean by integration, because it's thrown around a lot, and I think people assume that it's obvious, and that might even go to the coordination issue. I don't know if you agree with that. That's what I caught from what you guys were saying.
Thank you. Or do you want to say something, Charlie?
Just very briefly. I don't know whether I agree with that or not, but I think a lot of the debate has really nothing to do with serious, intellectual, honest debate along the lines you said. I think so much of it just has to do with getting more organs or not.
Yes.
And I'll echo that, Charlie. I can't tell you how disgusting it was for me over the last 2 years when I said, well, if we have doubt, and Hans Jonas said this, and certainties of, in cases of doubt, you need to bend over backward in favor of life. If we do not have prudential certitude, we should not be doing this sort of thing. And it was so disgusting that people did not care that these patients might be alive. They frankly did not care. It was, what can we get out of them?
Next question.
Hi, Kathleen Birchholm. I'm from My Catholic Doctor, and I'm a pediatrician that's spent a lot of time in ICUs. My question is, have you brought this to any hospital systems or the Catholic Healthcare Leadership Alliance, and are there any facilities actually doing the expanded testing?
There is a lot of pushback. I had tried to bring this to my own facility, and they said, well, we can't go against the AN practice guidelines, and, well, no one else is doing it. And I was like, well, just because no one else is doing the right thing doesn't make the right thing any less right to do. There was a nice webinar, CHA webinar, where Georgetown University said, look, we need to be expanding testing. And I think Georgetown might be leading the way in this. At the very least, and this is to your point, Charlie, I think we need to be getting informed consent. But that's a whole nother talk.
Thank you.
And I very quickly, I've been in discussions with people at the Catholic Healthcare Leadership Alliance on this, and there is talk about new ERDs right now, but it's not clear what's going to come from all that.
And it's interesting, I just got asked to review an article asking for new ERDs, so.
Next question.
Hi, Chris very briefly brought up the UK guidelines in regards to brain death. Is there an international element to this change for the United States? Is it being inspired from changes abroad in Europe or further afield? That's
Good question.
So the UK standard is pretty much in line with the World Brain Death Project, which is being pushed by, I forget the Canadian guy's name, but Arian Lewis and the guys that are pushing the AN practice guidelines. They want brain death to be this brain stem death or this partial brain death standard worldwide. That's what they're pushing for. The nice part is, like Poland, for example, said, look, that ain't going to fly. There is a test, a C2 perfusion test that shows a very good reliability that accurately detects loss of function of the entire brain, and so it'll be interesting to see if people, resort to those sorts of procedures.
Next question.
Hi there, Jeremy Bennett. I'm a hospitalist in Ontario, Canada, and a student at Georgetown in ethics. My question is for Dr. Camosy, just with regard to, so John Paul II, I think his sort of statement on this, and kind of correct me if I'm wrong, on brain death is that whole brain death is not inconsistent with the Christian anthropology. And so for you and those like you who are kind of more skeptical of the diagnosis of brain death, could you maybe kind of talk about maybe where you see some friction with whole brain death and Christian anthropology, where some of that friction may lie?
Yeah, and just to repeat the context that I tried to highlight in my talk or my remarks, and that Christian Bruger put forward first is there really has to be an acknowledgement that so much of what St. John Paul II said is based on his knowledge of biology at the time and those advising him about the biology at the time. And we've seen throughout, if you know anything about church history, things get shifted around when we learn new things about science and biology, right? That's just something that happens. So, but to your substantial question, substantial part of your question, I'll just say this again, I really do think locating homeostasis, consciousness, the integrity of the human person, whatever phrase we want to use, in a single organ like the brain is just completely wrong-headed with Catholic anthropology, right? Especially, but not only if one has a Thomistic Aristotelian understanding of how the soul animates the body. So I could say more about that, but there are a lot of questions.
Well, and I would agree with you, Charlie, and that's why I said, look, you can't be organ specific because it doesn't make any sense. We know that, babies who do not have a developed nervous system are clearly alive, and so that's why, when we look at it, it's not loss of, the brain per se, it's a loss of the cerebrosomatic homeostatic integration combined with loss of respiratory integration combined with loss of mind-body integration, which is what would be brain death. Now, whether or not the brain is affected in those, patients without brains, obviously it wouldn't happen. But again, being organ specific, I think, is a big problem. And I think a lot of the problem had with people, stamping their feet and saying, look, the brain's the master integrator of the body. No. But the brain is vital for self-integration in adults.
Next question, John.
By additional testing, I assume you mean some form of hypothalamic testing. In that situation, would it be proof of death if there was no secretion or decreased secretion? And number two, I also assume additional imaging. You're looking at brain flow study. Would a brain flow study with a negative, meaning no blood flow, essentially stating that there's no ongoing substrate for any brain function, would that trump other tests that would be ambiguous, like hypothalamic testing might be?
Well, let's put it this way. I would argue, and we actually have a paper that we submitted to CHEST that should be coming out here, ensuring that they have diabetes insipidus right off the bat is a good marker. Because look at TK. He had some diabetes insipidus initially with his diagnosis, but then as time went on, he obviously continued to have the ability to maintain saltwater balance and didn't develop diabetes insipidus until he died. So that would be the first step. But I would actually say we should go a step further and say, look, you got to check for diabetes insipidus. The other thing is, guess what? If you're gestating a pregnancy, the hypothalamus is vitally important for that as well. So that would be a marker as well. But I would also add the CT perfusion studies. I think Poland's, doing a good job saying, look, this has to be part of the testing. And I think it should be equal. I don't think that, just saying, well, this CT perfusion is better than this testing. No, I'd argue we should do both.
Next question, Dylan.
So as a resident physician, two of my responsibilities at the hospital are pronouncing people dead and also running codes, doing CPR on people without a pulse. And oftentimes when I step into a room, I find that the patient's body in either of those cases looks quite similar. It can be a warm, pulseless body. And so when I go to pronounce someone dead, maybe what I'm doing is pronouncing that that their permanent cessation or permanent integration has ceased, but maybe it's not irreversible in all of those cases because the same people who look like that are the ones that we're doing CPR on, and some of them come back. So what I'm wondering is, how can we have a degree of certitude that the patient has actually died without prolonging the time to harvest organs so long that organ donation is no longer even possible within our healthcare system?
So to be clear, whether or not someone is dead has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not they're an organ donor. I think one of the big problems we have is that we're not giving people time. So for example, when you look at brain injury, you're going to get maximal brain swelling 72 hours after that injury. I would argue that you need to be waiting at least that long. And one thing that we do in pediatrics that they don't do in the adult land is that we require 2 tests over space and time. And I would also say you've got to be careful about permanence with brain death because the brain undergoes liquefactive necrosis. And when the brain liquefies and is flushed out of the system, that's not permanent, that's irreversible. Not
Chris,
to mention...
let me interrupt just because maybe it connects to Dylan's question.
Oh, sure.
Are you guys all agreeing that donation after cardiac death is not those folks are not dead?
Well, no, if you have cardiac death, ultimately, you will disintegrate and die. So there is a point where you could donate your organs.
Okay. Well, I guess what Dylan's pointing out, or I think, or at least seems relevant to me, that in those cases, if someone waits 3 minutes or 5 minutes, those are folks that Dylan could resuscitate in some cases. If he tried, some of them would be resuscitatable and they would no longer be dead. So it seems odd to say they're dead. And this kind of gets to Jeff's point.
But 5 minutes isn't long enough. That's the problem. Again, people are rushing it. At 5 minutes, your brain is still alive. Your brain is still functioning. You are still a self-integrating individual.
I taught this to my seminarians last week, and it took me 30 seconds to find a Google story of somebody being resuscitated 45 minutes after they arrested. So I really think this is an important question. I really think this is a deep question we need to wrestle with almost as much as brain death. We were mostly talking about brain death today. But I think it's deeply problematic that we wait 5, 10, 15 minutes and declare somebody dead precisely because we need their organs, right? We need their organs fresh and as transplantable as possible. It seems to be a cousin of the problem we're facing with brain death as well.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left, so what we're going to do is get these 4 questions briefly on the table, and then we'll get some final comments. I may throw in a brief one of my own. Loris.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate the focus on this very important question. I'm struck these days how people like Robert True from Boston are willing to say that brain death does not equal biological death, despite the fact that he's a great proponent of the kinds of things that you've been basically attacking today. I'm still struck, even despite having had some conversations with folks at the Pellegrino Center, with some of us who are on the CMD Ethics Committee, to get at this question that you and Dan have promoted regarding integration, but specifically self-integration. What I confess I don't understand and am not persuaded by is that why should integration play such an essential role for your understanding when we are already very successful in our ICUs and through other technologies in replacing with technology the integration of the circulatory system, of the respiratory system, and then neurohormonally in the ICU. So I'm not persuaded that you have put your finger on something that is essentially human as opposed to these additional physiological properties that are, typical of the human, but not essential to keep someone alive and warm and pulsating.
I know Chris wants to respond, but I'm going to not let him just yet. Go ahead.
We see here briefly the distinction or the ongoing debate in Catholic theology as to whether brain death, whole brain death, is a criteria of death or not. And we see kind of the open debate or question there. I'm curious if each of you could speak a bit more explicitly to how you would respond to difficult cases against your position, to those who would suggest that no, whole brain death is in fact not a criteria we should be using, responding to those who would point out difficult cases where it seems like pulmonary or respiratory functioning is still taking place, but maybe we have an intuitive sense it seems like this is no longer a living individual, versus on the other hand to those who would suggest brain death or advocate that as a valid criteria, that there are at least proposed cases where opponents would argue, well, doesn't this, hasn't this person continued on to have their period, to gestate an infant, et cetera? And so just responding to those problem cases for either position.
Will definitely, the problem cases will be available for discussion after this session, but let's briefly hear these last two questions and then a brief word from our speakers. Yes.
I want to thank the panel for just having a really concise and clear presentation of a very muddy issue. I'm hoping you can address a concern I have about specifically a more hylomorphic view of the soul being used as part of our definition of life here. If we're trying to determine if there's still biological life, it seems like we're going to end up with an untenable standard of death. In Aristotelian or Thomistic thought, understanding the soul to be the principle of life